Alright guys, we're going to continue this conversation about genetics. This is coming from my PowerPoint, this one right here. We just started talking about Gregor Mendel and the stuff he had figured out. Um, you really just need to read these right here, the law of segregation and the law of independent assortment. I think the Bozeman video on my website under biology, genetics, and there's genetics or Punnett Square video 1 and 2 explains it a lot better than I'm going to. So the thing I do think I can explain pretty well, though, is let's just take a look at this phenomenon right here, okay? Here is something that's not explained very well with Gregor Mendel's genetics. Now, with his pea plants, there were 7 traits he looked at, and he didn't know this, but they happened to be on 7 different chromosomes. And if you look at one that was the gene for tallness, it was very simple. Certain pea plants were very much one height, and other pea plants were short, and they were pretty consistent across the board. Depending on what soil you planted them in, or fertilizer, or sunlight, and things like that, you might have a little variety. But for the most part, some pea plants were tall and some were short. Now, you know that's not how that is with humans. In other words, it's way more complex. And here's a good example. We have some people that, I don't know if it was a college class or something from a long time ago, but they have the young men wearing black and the young ladies wearing white. And they basically just arrange them by height. And you can see that there's 5 foot, 5'1", 5'2", 5'3", 5'4". And you can see that most of the girls are in this 5'6" category. And you come over here and most of the guys are in this kind of 5'10" category. And it makes a bell curve. It makes kind of this, like, not a lot on the edges, not a lot on this edge, and most of them are lumped in the middle. So opposite of what Gregor Mendel's pea plants were, where you had a whole bunch at one end and a whole bunch at the other end. No, it's a bell curve. It's this sweep where most of them are actually in the middle. How is that possible? What kind of genetic explanation is there for this? So basically, we're going to start talking about the branch of genetics that are non-Mendelian genetics. I thought that said that in here. They're not. This is like the exceptions to the rules. And here's all the non-Mendelian things that would have thrown Gregor a loop. He would have never been able to figure out genetics with this. So over here I said many traits have a wide range of continuous values, like human height. They, 5 foot, 5'4", 6 foot, 6'5". There's a huge range of these. There's not just tall or short. So one possible explanation for this is this polygenetic inheritance. Just break this down. Poly means many, genetic means genes. This is when you have many genes controlling one trait. Now, a gene is a section of DNA that controls a trait. A trait is something that is passed down, something that is expressed. In this case, I don't know if you can tell this or not, but this is skin pigment. This is a really, really cool example, and it's a little bit tricky. In this case, same thing with skin pigment. You don't just have black or white. There's very pale, there's kind of yellow skin, then there's kind of Caucasian, and there's kind of a slightly darker than Caucasian, then there's kind of brown, and there's very brown, and then black. There's a whole range of skin pigments, and they are controlled by 3 separate genes. It's polygenetic. One trait, 1, 2, 3 genes. Unlike the pea plants, where it was one trait, one gene, and a story. And because of this, you can have within these genes different kind of genotypes within it. So this, I don't know if you can see this right here, but you can see that 3 genes that are controlling skin pigment. The first gene they've labeled with A's, the second gene they've labeled with B's, and this third gene they've labeled with C's. So A is a gene for skin pigment, B is a gene for skin pigment, and C is a gene for skin pigment. Within those, you can be homozygous dominant, a hybrid, or homozygous recessive. Each time you have a dominant letter showing up, it's like a dose of melanin, or the pigment that makes your skin black. So in this case, if you have a hybrid, you're going to have 3 of these dominant traits and 3 of the recessive traits. And you're going to be kind of in the middle. And you're going to see this right here. You're going to see this classic bell curve where you're just like, well, if you're a hybrid, you're going to have a dark, 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 and a light, 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 and you're going to be somewhere in the middle. And as luck would have it, I mean, not luck, statistically, that's where most people fall, is somewhere in this middle. They might have 2 or 3 of these dark genes and maybe some other ones on. Just like flipping a coin once again. This is like flipping a coin 6 times. And if you flip a coin 6 times, the most common outcome is going to be 3 heads and 3 tails. Now it might go heads, 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 tails, tails, tails. It might go heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails. It might go heads, heads, tails, tails, heads, tails. It doesn't really matter. The most common combination is going to have 3 heads and 3 tails. In this case, if you have a person who's hybrid, 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 cross with someone who's hybrid, 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 you're going to kind of get this sweeping little bell curve where most of the time you're going to see something in the middle. What's really, really cool is the fact that you can see all these different ways to combine 3 black and 3 white. This one up in the top corner would be like having a coin that has a head and a tail, or in reality it's pigment that's black and white, and you flip it one time, or flip it, we gotta flip it 3 times because it's 3 genes, and getting tails, 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 and crossing it with someone else who had 3 genes that were black and 3 genes are white. It's really just either, if you don't have the skin pigment, it's just there is no pigment. So it's kind of like you either have the melanin or you don't. It's not like a gene for whiteness. Whiteness is just a lack of melanin. So you'd have tails, tails, tails crossed, and you somehow get tails, tails, tails. Think back to that snake Punnett square we did, where you basically are choosing which allele to go with. And if you could somehow, it'd be very unlikely that you'd get tails, 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 but if you did, you'd have a very pale baby. You could actually have someone who's kind of a Caucasian, maybe even brownish skin pigment, produce an extremely pale baby. And the really neat thing is you could also flip that and one time get heads, 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 and then heads, heads, heads. In other words, as you're picking these genes and putting them into sperm or egg, one of the dominant dark genes and another dominant dark gene and another dominant dark gene goes into an egg, crossed with someone who's got the same genotype here, and they donate a dominant dark, a dominant dark, and a dominant dark. And you get a sperm that has 3 dark genes and an egg that has 3 dark genes. And even though your parents are kind of whitish brown, you'd have a baby that would come out black. There's a really interesting case where a German couple, or they were kind of mutts, so to speak. They had some dark genes and white genes. They were basically just like this setup here. And they had twin girls. One of the girls happened to get all of the albino, I shouldn't say that. One of the girls got none of the dark genes whatsoever. Kind of going heads, 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 heads. And the other girl happened to get all 6 black pigment genes. And it's really not even a dominant or recessive. It's just, how many of these genes do you get? Black is not dominant over white. It's just how many doses of this. Well, she got 6 doses of melanin, and she came out black. And you had identical twin girls. One was super fair skin, and one was super black. Believe it or not, this is where things get kind of crazy. I'll show you a picture of that in class. So that's how you can get this bell curve. Now, that example I just gave is really rare. If you have parents that are kind of brownish and you cross them together, most of the time the baby will come out brown. You might have some variety there. And you've seen this. If you have a black male and a white female and they get together and have a kid, their kids are going to be kind of brownish in the middle, which you would expect. It's just that you have a whole bunch of genes determining, in this case, 3 from mom and 3 from dad, and you can have so many different combinations. Now, obviously, if you take this right here, where you have a black father who has all 6 black pigment genes, and you mix them with a black female that has all 6 black pigment genes, it's scientifically impossible to produce a white kid. You can only produce these hybrid brown kids if the parents are hybrids to begin with, or if you take a black and a white and mix them. If you have black and black, it's scientifically impossible to produce a white unless they're albino, which is totally different. Let's look at this example right here. We have these hydrangeas. These are actually genetically the exact same. So why is one purple and one magenta? Well, this is an environmental factor. In other words, if you plant these in certain soils, and if they're very acidic, you'll get one color. And if you plant it in a very basic or very high pH, you'll get a different color. They actually use hydrangeas for litmus paper. In other words, they use these to test what the pH of certain chemicals are. Take this example and apply it over here. If you have a kid who's genetically made up to be, they got 2 doses of black melanin and 4 doses that are missing, so they only have 2 of these dark genes, but they spend a lot of time outside, they might slide a little closer this way. In other words, you have 3 genes controlling your skin pigment, but then you throw in an environmental impact. You go in a tanning bed a lot, you grow up near the equator, it might get darker. Or you're down here and you don't go out in the sun very much, you might not express very much of that melanin. You might actually be paler than normal. So your genes kind of give you a range to work in, and the environment moves you around within there. Obviously, a person who has got black parents, if they don't go out in the sun, it's not like they turn white. Your genetics just give you a range that you can work within. And if you're really pale, if you're down on this end, it doesn't matter how much you get in a tanning bed, how much you spend outside, you're going to max that melanin out. You've seen some people who are pale, it's like, I can go out in the sun for hours, I just don't tan, I just burn. So it's not like, oh, stay on the sun longer. No, the environment can only take you so far. That brings up this nature versus nurture debate. If a student is smart, is it because of their genes or the way they were raised? If someone is tan, is it because of their genes or how much time they spend out in the sun? If someone is fat, is it because of their genes or is it because of the food they eat? I mean, this is a really classic example. You look at an overweight young man or woman and you see, okay, they're fat. Then you look at their parents and they're fat. You could say, well, they're fat because their parents have a thyroid issue or they have a slow metabolism or they're just kind of built that way. Or you could say, no, the parents are fat because it had nothing to do with genetics. They eat really unhealthy food and they put that same unhealthy food in front of that kid. So from the age of 0 to 17, the kid basically is dependent and has to eat whatever the parents put in front of them. So if they're eating fast food or deep fat fried or high carb stuff, of course they're going to be fat. And you see this a lot. You say, fat mom, fat dad must be a fat kid. No, it's genetic. As soon as they start to get into college and start to eat what they want, they lose all this weight and you realize that wasn't genetic at all. And then other times it's like, well, it has everything to do with genetics. So which is more important, your genes or the way you're raised? I mean, you have a kid, you've probably known someone like this who doesn't really have to try that hard. They just go to class and they just get material very quick. They don't have to study and they do well on tests. Then you have other kids who try and their parents get them tutors and they go to a really good school and they do their best and they just can't quite reach that pinnacle. You're talking about how you're raised versus what you are. The nature is what your genes are and how you're naturally made. Nurture is how you're brought up. There's lots and lots of examples of this. And which is more important? Well, once again, genes give you a range to work within and how your nurture will move you around within there. Really, so the nature is the genes that your traits, your bloods, and your dreams that you're born with. Nurture is just anything that happens after you're born. So this is a really cool example here. They have this little chart that says, okay, most of the stuff's in the middle. Take diabetes. There's a genetic predisposition to it, but if you eat lots of sugary foods, it can make your diabetes come out a lot quicker. And actually, there is a cure for diabetes. If you don't eat sugary food and you work out all the time, you will not have any diabetic symptoms. It's actually the fact that we don't move around as we used to when we were a nomadic species, when we were a hunter-gatherer society, and we didn't have access to processed sugar, and we were constantly on the move and basically walked 20, 30 miles a day. Diabetes, we were burning through the little tiny bit of sugar we had in our bodies so quick. It was like, diabetes? People die from having too much sugar? That seems impossible. Certain things, like Down syndrome, for example, has nothing to do with where you're raised. That's a genetic problem, and there's nothing you can environmentally do to fix it. PKU, it's a genetic problem, but if you have a really strict diet, you might be able to curb it. Take something over here like scurvy, has nothing to do with your genes. It's just, do you get enough vitamin C or not? No vitamin C, you are going to get scurvy. Matter of fact, everything's within this range. Now, can you think of maybe a few things? Everything's a combination of nature versus nurture. Try to think of a few things that maybe aren't. Really, it's extremely hard to think of things that are just based on your traits or based solely on the way you were raised. I'll let you think of a few examples, but something that's based only on genetics, and it doesn't matter how you're raised, you're going to be that way. And other things that matter not at all on your genes is if you're raised in a certain environment or raised a certain way or something happens to you after you're born, it doesn't matter what your genetics are. It's completely based on the way you were raised. It's really kind of cool to think about that. So I'll let you do that before we go on to our next video.